Good morning. We are very excited about having you all in this session 6, Digital Enablement during the pandemic. How connectivity helped e-government, e-health, e-education, home office, and so on, to keep livelihoods, and normal lives remotely. Thank you, all the panelists, for joining us. I will be introducing each of you as you speak. We will have an initial round of 7 minutes for each to tell us about how in your country, your organization, or the region, the pandemic was faced, what responses were given in times of pandemic and economic recession, and how this intense collaboration between governments, regulators, industries, and organizations could become permanent in order to enable digital inclusion, universal service, digital transformation that is inclusive, fair, and that catalyzes productivity and sustainable development goals. I am delighted to introduce you to Carlos Lugosilva from Colombia. He currently serves as Executive Director and Commissioner for the Communications Regulation Commission of Colombia. He's also a researcher, and for years he has been an expert in innovative ways of educating using digital technologies, something that will be very important for every student that will shortly be learning online for almost a year, or in some cases more than a year. Carlos, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Now, thank you, Adriana. It's a pleasure to be here today, and good morning. It's an honor to be in the IAC annual Washington, D.C. conference, and my special greetings to all the other panelists and to the moderator, of course. I have been invited to share with you in the first place our learnings during the COVID-19 crisis, and of course, what is our vision for the future to help our country in the final connectivity gap. From the healthy competition, investment promotion, and most importantly, with the high quality of communication and postal services and the protection of users. It's there where smart regulation appears, and as a way to accelerate the pending deployment in connectivity and in general to accompany public policies for internet connectivity and the country's digital development. Within regulation, I will share our vision on simplification, digitization, deregulation, self-regulation, and regulatory innovation with experimental schemes such as regulatory sandboxes. To begin, I will share what I consider the most important learnings. The global pandemic of COVID-19 represents a global challenge for the ICT and postal sector and for regulators as well, in addition to those related and restructuring through the convergence. The first thing was to be clear about what to regulate during the pandemic. The priorities in Colombia were guarantee of access, continuity of service, incentive to companies to continue deployment, quality and protection of users. In the case of Colombia, one of the first challenges was to design and implement in record time about 24 measures that would respond to the new reality, guarantee citizen access to quality telecommunications and postal services, and protect their rights. Those measures were key to the development of labor, commercial, health, and education activities during the health emergency. The COVID-19 crisis is teaching us that we must take the leap without fear, that the structure of our economies is changing, and that only the digital economy will allow us to quickly as possible. At a global level, the pandemic has made us adapt to a totally unexpected situations, being an experiment that otherwise we would not have been able to do related to transparency and speed with information reports, especially information related to the state of the networks associated with the internet, possibility of using digital mechanisms for the attention of users and the notification of invoices, develop mechanisms to facilitate payment of services, etc., etc., etc. The second was related to the evidence for making those quick decisions. Our strategies in the regulator in Colombia were, for example, in internet traffic monitoring every 2 days to avoid collapse, the knowledge of the ecosystems, the different studies that we developed in the past were very important for those quick decisions in the CRT. And another learning were the coordination and collaboration between the different stakeholders. That's the third. Without networks, there is not content. Without content, there are not networks. Coordination was essential during the pandemic. Network operators and OTT platforms took a step to avoid network collapse, such as lowering video quality without affecting the user experience. And finally, the coordination between the regulators and the government. For example, the coordination between the regulator of energy and the regulator for communication were very important for infrastructure sharing, as a good example. Due to this new reality, smart regulation becomes relevant. This type of regulation constitutes a way of working in a new vision of the ICT, postal, and audiovisual regulator, based on collaboration, on the simplification of regulatory frameworks, on the reduction of charge, the generation of self-regulation, as well as the use of technologies and data. In the smart regulation time, is better the crowdfunding methodology to have quality information in real time, for example. Also have the information about rates using technology and interoperability between regulator and operator platforms. A smart regulation is to protect the users and consumer rights with digital solutions, for example, not only with physical office, but with digital offices. And smart regulation serves to respond to technological evolution and change in consumer habits. For example, flexibility makes it possible to boost markets and promote greater investment. In this way of smart regulation, the regulatory sandbox appears as an opportunity to provide concrete exceptions from regulation to promote the deployment of connectivity or new communication services, and that regulation is not, and the regulation is not an obstacle. In 2020, we launched the first regulatory sandbox in telecommunication in the world, in order to achieve regulatory flexibility for the deployment of communication in the most remote areas of the country. This is an innovative bet for the benefit of those who are not connected today, and with a clear goal that by 2025, more than 90% of citizens in my country have access to mobile internet, and 80% of those connections will be at least 4G. We are now in the preparation of a stage for the implementation of the sandbox in early 2021. We expect projects that promote connectivity through new business and increase technology adoption. In conclusion, we are in a moment of no return. Public policies and regulation must experiment, innovate, test new ways to close the connectivity gap, and provide citizens with access to the benefits of digital transformation. That is why, from the vision of the communication and postal regulator in Colombia, we bet on simplification, digitization of the regulation, information in real time, with fewer change, but in return for better quality of service and better rates. With this, we will be able to achieve greater economy and social development for our country from the digital technologies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carlos. Perfect timing. A lot of innovation, a lot to discuss. Innovation, smart regulation, simplification, preserve continuity, quality of service. I know we will have the opportunity to debate how this smart regulation is also put to serve the underserved, whether the sandboxes are only for large operators or also for community networks or smaller operators, and how you have managed to thrive in this coordination with ministries of education, of health, and all these layers that are needed for telemedicine, for content, for human capital. And Nate will tell us about that. How do you train clinicians for telemedicine? How do you retain them, recruit them, and train them for rural communities, etc.? So hopefully we'll have a chance to discuss this and the scope and extent of this smart regulation. But for now, I would like to introduce you to Dr. Modimoeng. Dr. Modimoeng was appointed Executive Chairperson of the Independent Communications Authority of South Africa. He's a former award-winning Sunday Times journalist and has an incredible experience in telecoms, media, and regulatory issues. And we will love to learn about ICASA's actions and policies regarding spectrum and rural access and staying connected digitally when the pandemic hit us all. Dr. Modimoeng, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and greetings to my fellow panel members, the panelists, and to all the participants and viewers. Indeed, it's a great honor and a privilege to be here today to just share, the experience from a South African perspective on how we grappled with ensuring seamless connectivity during the lockdown period, as it was called in our country. So I would just like to take you through literally a few slides to contextualize the background of how we arrived at the interventions we have. So I will just take you through. Thank you very much. So I will just touch, give an overview of the organizational mandate, just in passing, and the impact rather of COVID-19 on the ICT sector in South Africa, and then a number of regulatory interventions which we introduced, and those would then relate to the temporary assignment of spectrum, the licensing process that we embarked on, and the conditions and obligations imposed in line with the theme of our discussion today around e-education and so forth. And just closing with the lessons learned. So we are an independent body established and working very closely, reporting to the Parliament in South Africa. Now, what had happened in our context is that there was a declaration of a national state of disaster in March of 2020, which resulted in a national lockdown. This meant, a closure of workplaces, schools, etc. And there was then an inherent increased demand for connectivity. And this was occasioned by remote working, e-learning, in line with the theme of our discussion for today. Now, there was a big risk in our context, the risk of network congestion and the poor quality of service. Because I will contextualize as I go further that this pandemic found us while we were busy trying to license spectrum on a more permanent basis. And as a result of that, we had to, think of an intervention in the immediate of the temporary assignment of high demand spectrum. And this was done on an expedited basis. We also allowed, for spectrum sharing or pooling, where our licensees were then allowed during this window of the lockdown period to make representations for the spectrum pooling arrangements. But we also understood that this was business unusual. Now, issues relating to the spectrum fees, we introduced a waiver. Because as part of this emergency spectrum licensing occasioned by COVID, we placed in a number of obligations. So we felt that since licensees, your mobile operators will be performing certain obligations, we could then waive the fees for a particular period. And we also then eased the license, terms and conditions. And this one was around the issue of license fees, which were deferred for a period of over 3 months. And on the broadcasting side of things, annual general meetings for community broadcasters were also suspended because, converging in large groups and so forth was prohibited during that period. So we introduced some regulatory flexibility. Now, we introduced an expedited regulatory approval process. And this was on, type approval matters for new equipment, because some of the operators did not have certain, radios for the temporarily assigned spectrum, more so if it was not. Now, the bands that we issued temporary assignments for is the IMT 700, 800, as well as 2600 and 3500. Now, the criteria that we looked at during the period was network performance of applicants. So we needed them to give us a scenario of how they envisaged the uptake, the same, also informed by our quality of service reports, the models of network performance, after using the additional spectrum. So we were monitoring the utilization of that spectrum stringently during the period, and the benefits to be realized for consumers, because a spectrum is a national asset belonging to South Africans. It's a public good. So we wanted to see like a reduction in the cost to communicate, data prices, some promotions around free daily bundle to consumers, Wi-Fi connectivity in public places. So this particular temporary assignment, we have just extended it on the 30th of November, and its validity period will lapse on the 31st of March 2021. Now, we then prioritized rural and underserviced communities. We embarked and partnered with an agency of our Department of Science and Technology to deal with the issues of geolocation satellite database for the TV white space allocations. And as I've indicated, there was the type approval activity. Now, this was just the process flow of how the entire process unfolded with the timelines. Now, the conditions: school connectivity, which is virtual classrooms, connectivity to identified underserviced areas, at 10 megabits per second. The reduction in data cost, as I've indicated. Reports on the implementation of the obligation. So our licensees have been reporting to us on, how they are doing with connecting those rural schools, and also the question of zero rating of content for public schools and universities and technical and vocational colleges, where a lot of curriculum was availed on a zero-rated basis, where end users, consumers, the underprivileged would not need to spend for that particular service. Now,
sorry, we're running out of time.
Okay. Yes, but I think it's just a repetition of how widespread the obligations were. Zero rating of 200 sites and platforms, and 17 virtual classrooms per licensee. So this was effectively the last slide, and a number of lessons were learned. agility is our biggest takeaway point. Thank you very much for your audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Modimoeng, and we'll have time to share how these obligations of providing connectivity to schools, to health clinics, etc., could be probably the start of a like permanent action for approaching sustainable development goals by using ICT tools. Thank you. Now I have the pleasure to introduce to you Nate Williams. Nate is the Director of Public Policy at LinkedIn. He's an expert in workforce technology and labor market information. He's responsible at LinkedIn for evaluating, defining, and executing policy partnerships that leverage LinkedIn's technology as a means of completing the LinkedIn economic graph, a digital map on the global economy. Nate, welcome. We are very excited to hear about LinkedIn, how it can help recover work, how it will foster freelancers through the platform, and what you have seen and analyzed both in Latin America, in South Africa. What are the trends or the major lessons from LinkedIn as to, again, recover employment and very valuable talent that probably are right now out of a job, but that could find livelihoods through the platform. Welcome, Nate.
Thank you. Thank you, Adriana. I appreciate the gathering that you and the IIC have put together. I hope to be with you all in person next year in the DC conference, as I'm sure we all do. I especially appreciate you having me here because I'm not, as with others, an expert on spectrum auctions or communications regulations necessarily, but as Carlos and Dr. Modimoeng spoke about the efforts that were undertaken in light of the pandemic, I felt a sense of gratitude for all the work that they do, that members of the audience do, to keep communications strong. LinkedIn, as I think most of you would know, is a service that operates and benefits from expanded bandwidth in developed and the developing world. And in fact, when the pandemic hit, we saw demand for example, LinkedIn learning courses, which help job seekers and those that have been dislocated from the labor markets return back to work. So we saw about a 3x increase in LinkedIn learning video usage. Microsoft, which is our parent company, has seen a dramatic increase in demand for Teams and other tools that enable virtual work to go forward. So I think one of the things that maybe we can reflect back on at the end of the year is just how much better off we are for the work that this members of this gathering have done in keeping our economy, political, and health systems resilient in the face of the pandemic. I'll focus my remarks on two major themes. So the first theme that I was asked to cover is cooperative action during the crisis. And for this section, I'll talk a little bit about LinkedIn's work with the World Health Organization. As part of my job at LinkedIn, I work with intergovernmental and multilateral organizations, and the UN is taking a leadership role in combating misinformation related to COVID-19. And I'll talk a little bit about what the collaboration with that institution has been for LinkedIn. And then in the second part of my remarks, I'll talk about some of the gaps that we have seen laid bare in the pandemic. And because LinkedIn is a graph that works with professionals, these are going to be gaps that relate to professional and economic trends that we can see through our data. So I'll get into that in just a moment. But to start with, when the pandemic hit, and I can remember this because I was flying from California, where I live, to Paris the last week in February, and I flew back the first week in March, and the difference in flying in and flying out was stark. And one thing that was remarkable to me was just how quickly the world shifted into that lockdown mode. So when I got back, we had a couple conversations with the World Health Organization and determined a model for collaboration. And this model had three basic planks in the platform. First of all, we connected our editorial team with the World Health Organization's social media team. And so we worked with them to identify accurate information and then worked to broadcast that accurate information over our network to our members. And also to give trusted organizations a voice and more reach to do the same. So collaborated really closely with the World Health Organization, including the Director General, who is a LinkedIn influencer and thus had a larger voice on our platform. Second thing that we did was we worked with the World Health Organization to staff up critical positions that were needed to combat the pandemic. So we made available all of the tools that we provide to recruiters, to employers, the job slots that we have. We put them at the disposal of the World Health Organization and other national health organizations as well. In the US, that's the CDC. And we helped them attract over 12,000 candidates that they use to staff up their operations fully. Even in a pandemic, it's not always easy to hire. And so because the World Health Organization didn't have recruiters in place, we actually took a group of LinkedIn recruiters, the ones that help us hire software engineers and marketers and the like. And we had them work on behalf of the World Health Organization and other organizations that were rapidly trying to staff up healthcare and policy positions to fight the pandemic. And then the last thing that we did with the World Health Organization is we joined what was called the Tech Task Force. And on the Tech Task Force, there were different subgroups, and we chaired the subgroup on fighting misinformation related to COVID. And so this is not something that we did unilaterally. We worked very closely with the World Health Organization. We worked very closely with other companies that likewise operate platforms where citizens receive information. And so, we're happy to partner with Google, with Facebook, with some of the other several dozen tech companies that showed up on the Tech Task Force. So the work isn't done for us. It's far too early, as we're all aware, to claim any kind of victory. We're happy to have taken down misinformation, to have promoted accurate information. That need continues as we move from hopefully a place to where we're talking less about the disease itself and more about the vaccine and efforts to mitigate the vaccine and mitigate the economic effect of the pandemic on the world. So that need for accurate information is going to grow even more as the vaccine starts to roll out. The second broad area that I'll cover, and mindful of the clock here, is trends that we see in the economies that have been affected by the pandemic. And here there are really three gaps to be mindful of. One is a skills gap. The second is network gaps, and then third are gender gaps. And what we see in the pandemic when we look at LinkedIn data are trends in these underlying areas. One thing to note about LinkedIn's data, currently our member graph has over 700 million professionals, 55 million companies, 14 million jobs, 36,000 skills in our taxonomy, and about 115,000 schools. So when we look for economic trends, we're doing that using aggregated data that is near real time from that large network of member activity. So I'll just relate a couple different insights and then give time back. When we looked at the effect of the pandemic on the recovery, we saw that many members, many citizens didn't have basic digital literacy skills, which is less of a concern in a physical world, but more of a concern when people are meeting, learning, receiving healthcare virtually. Second thing that we saw, and this pertains to the gender gap, is that a lot of the emerging jobs, those that are fastest growing, require skills in new and disruptive technologies where women are less well represented compared with men. And this is a factor that is only going to exacerbate existing gender gaps that were present prior to the pandemic. We saw globally that female hiring reached a low in April. In April, women accounted for 40.6% of all hires. This recovered in June and July. The share of hiring women recovered to about 45% as restrictions were gradually lifted. But that's an important reminder that in the world of work, women are still asked to do work that is unpaid, still asked to do work that is less well represented and often puts women in harm's way, especially during the pandemic. The last thing that I'll mention here is the network gap and its effect on workers who are in declining jobs. So when we speak of a network gap in LinkedIn, which is a network, we're able to see how members are connected one to another. And the obvious insight to make is that members who are connected to others have an easier time navigating a job search. If I know 100 people that can help me find my next job, then I will on average find my next job more successfully than someone who is less well connected. So we see network gaps limiting the job search potential for members that have been dislocated by COVID, and that's something that concerns us. The connection to declining jobs is we're able to look at jobs on the LinkedIn platform that are declining, jobs that are emerging or growing. And what we'd like to see in the pandemic are workers who have been affected by the pandemic. So think of hospitality, think of retail jobs, able to transition to jobs that are growing, those that require digital skills, for example. And instead, what we see is too often workers in declining occupations move from one declining occupation to another declining occupation. And what's needed at the point in time where someone is, where a move is required, are skills that can help them bridge from the declining to an emerging occupation. And not just a skills bridge, but a network bridge as well. So we think in the future, if we can enable workers and policymakers to identify the skills that can affect a transition and build networks that are strong, that workers will become more resilient to this type of shock. And hopefully we don't see this type of shock in the future. It's not what I'm saying at all, but there will always be economic shocks that require a worker to make a shift or transition. And we believe that we can identify the skills that will make that transition easier to make for the worker so that they can become more resilient with their career. Lots more good data to talk about. I'm hopeful that we get great questions from the panel, but for now, Adriana, I'll turn time back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Nate. Really interesting, really scary to see how the gaps reproduce in the digital environment. The gender gaps, the divide gaps of people that have the digital skills as opposed to those who do not. And also, it would be interesting to know who is in LinkedIn. Is it more not only the organizations demanding labor, but what professionals, men to women, how many, rural to urban, what kind, and how will this transition be made both by schools, by governments, and by people to gain not only the basic digital skills, but more sophisticated skills that could be the jobs of today and tomorrow. No, data science analysts, AI, blockchain experts that can develop programs for their organizations. Second, that takes time, and education in those skills is not necessarily free or affordable, and even less in the rural contexts, where they could also use it for agribusiness, for different. But how do we not leave anyone behind, and especially girls and women? That's a big challenge. And how, I'd like to hear a bit later more about LinkedIn is gaining the trust, the confidence of users, because people on LinkedIn post very sensitive data. So how it is used so that no one is like profiled, or that an algorithm is not used so someone will never get a job because he or she put something there that was read by AI in a not positive way. That also how these platforms are trying to gain the trust of the users, I think it's important. Well, thank you. We'll have hopefully time to discuss this. And last but not least, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Karla Velasco, who I've known for several years now, and she's an amazing woman, talking about skills and youth and the power of women. Karla Velasco is the Latin America Regional Coordinator of the project Connecting the Unconnected, implemented by the Association of Progressive Communications, APC, Rhizomatica, which contributes to an enabling ecosystem for the emergence and growth of community-based connectivity initiatives in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. She has a background on international relations by the Autonomous Technological Institute of Mexico, ITAM, and Science Po Paris. She's a specialist in regulation, policy, and gender, with multiple publications in internet access, in community networks, gender, and technology. And she's also coordinating the international affairs area at Redes por la Diversidad, Equidad y Sostenibilidad, Redes AC in Mexico, an incredible NGO helping the unconnected connect themselves with their own networks in Oaxaca, for instance, where they have their own mobile network. Karla, welcome. Welcome to IIC, and would like to hear from you how your connectivity community models, community networks models, or small operator models responded and helped the rural people in Latin America and other regions to stay connected when they live in such remote areas, and whether all you've heard from your regulators are including community networks like in the sandbox or in spectrum assignments, or is it only for large commercial operators? The floor is yours, Karla.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to this space. I'm very excited to be here. First of all, I'm sorry, I'm having some connectivity issues. So perhaps if I freeze or if I stop at some time and you cannot see me anymore, can you let me know? So I can turn off my camera. Thank you. Yes, so Adriana was mentioning that as part of APC and being the Latin America Regional Coordinator, we mostly work with community-based connectivity initiatives, which are smaller initiatives for connecting the ones that are unconnected. These connectivity initiatives are led by citizens and groups of people that organize themselves and tend to create their own networks. These type of networks, of course, are an alternative, and they complement the ecosystem that already exists. So we know that in some rural areas, it has been very difficult for large companies or even the government to reach out to these small towns and connect the towns, or even offer a good quality internet. So these alternatives are part of these initiatives that connect the ones that are still unconnected. And now with COVID-19, it was even more difficult for the environment and the ecosystem of rural and remote areas, because most of life became virtual. And for them, it became impossible to be part of the ecosystem, right? We are at the cities, we can connect ourselves, we can have this conversation right now. But for many of these citizens and people in rural and remote areas, it has become impossible to be part of this type of living that we have created as a response for the COVID-19 pandemic. So some of the responses that that community networks, as we call them, have created in the face of COVID-19 have to do most likely with community resilience. So, for example, in many governments decided to apply measures for education to become virtual. So in some of these communities, for example, the communities have organized themselves and they have created local networks where the content is uploaded in the local network, and this network is not necessarily connected to the internet. So children from the community, parents from the community can connect themselves to this local network and are not left behind on this educational measure. So this is, for example, one of the things that has happened, not only in terms of connectivity, but this has been also a way of creating resilience and creating networks of care. So as I mentioned before, these are alternatives that are not in a fight with other types of connectivity, of bigger enterprises going to the towns and connecting them. It's most that the nature of the community networks and these community-based connectivity initiatives, the nature of these initiatives is more related to the ways of being and ways of organizing of the communities, right? So in these networks, we have seen that people organize themselves. There is economic support. There are ways of trading among each other. And it's not only about connectivity at the end, because in most of these responses, other types of communication have been important. For example, the radio, broadcasting, and other types of measures using more, we call them the HF radio, which is in the Amazon, which is a type of technology that can send messages along very, very long distances. So it's not just about connectivity, but it's other ways of communicating and connecting the people that have been very useful for this COVID-19 measures. So for another example that I wanted to share with you is the one that is happening right now at here in Mexico in a small community, where they created an initiative that is called Tayo Chikawalis, which means to have a stronger heart. So what they have done is that they have focused the communication inside the community and in the community network to talk about how they can take care of themselves. Instead of having this very intense point of view that COVID-19 is very dangerous and people should stay home, they turn the language around and they are sharing how they can take care of themselves, how can they eat healthier food, how can they use their traditions and their culture to protect themselves and to work together to face COVID-19. So these are some of the examples that happen among these networks that I mentioned before are mostly networks of care. And for example, now that violence has become stronger against women, now that we have to stay at home, for example, in Mexico, violence has risen towards women. These community networks have been also a place of encounter for women, a place for women to find themselves and work together and build resilience and exchange products and even become more economically independent. So we have seen in these community networks some of these responses, and I don't have much time now to end, to add to this contribution. So I think I would end my participation here and continue with the conversation with the rest of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Karla. And yes, we'll have a chance to discuss. You bring to us a picture that is important to have. People live in communities, not in federations. We live in communities, whether urban or rural. So what I hear from you is that when you are working at the community level, you have to think everything of the whole supply chain, the service, the language, the culture, the backhaul, the access network, the CapEx, the OpEx, the local content, and build bottom up, right? Not top down. Very well. Well, it's amazing how in different regions we see yet common challenges in this context of pandemia and lockdown and recession, but some constants of collaborative work, of things that were not able to be accomplished for decades. Governments, regulators get them done in 2 weeks or in 1 month. No red tape. No, it's not possible. In emergency time, we become assertive, we become creative. We have to find ways to do things and to solve problems. So what I'm reading is that no business as usual was made during these 6 months. And I think that would be a good catalyzer of how we can now work from now on more effectively, breaking paradigms and this no, it's not possible. And maybe that's what will make us more sustainable, more disruptive, and more inclusive, to have all the stakeholders contributing and also having the benefit of flexibility and affordability of services, of connections. So I have a question for now, given all these remarks by Karla. I was thinking, okay, in Colombia, all this innovation, the smart regulation and sandbox are going to be implemented, as Carlos said, basically in remote areas. There's still a profound digital divide in all Latin America, not only Colombia. Huge income inequalities, as in any other region. And so I'm thinking, if Colombia is being this innovative, disruptive, is this sandbox going to consider and allow for new stakeholders to come in? Community networks, small operators, light licensing, and the same for South Africa. With all this provisional spectrum awards and the coming, I know there's also a big spectrum auction coming, but will South Africa also assign spectrum for rural communities and not only to large operators? And so, because part of this innovation, I think, is to understand that the ecosystem has become larger, that small, medium, and micro enterprises are playing a role as ISPs, YISPs, or as content creators, etc. So, Carlos and Dr. Modimoeng, how are you bringing on board new stakeholders through these very innovative actions that you put in place months ago? Carlos.
Okay. So, but first, I want to speak about a challenge for a post-pandemic smart regulation, because I believe that the main challenge right now is the economic reactivation. This is a key of using a smart regulation. Each country has particularities in which it will work depending on the case, but we must all improve connectivity, connect the unconnected, and respond in quality to challenge of telework, telestudy, and leisure. Action in Colombia is highlighted. So for that, in parallel to the emergency measures that we made, we set an ambitious agenda that allow us to accelerate the definitive closure of connectivity gaps and the continuous improvement of the other services of communication whose access is already universal. So the different stakeholders, they are waiting for our actions, and they are waiting for the flexibility. So it's very important the appropriation of those new kind of regulation or the new ways to make regulation. Not all the companies are prepared for the sandboxes, or they know how to apply for the different sandboxes methodologies. So for the reason, in 2020, we are working in parallel with the companies to develop and to help to the companies to develop the projects for the connectivity, the project, for example, in postal sectors, because we know that we have to build capabilities for the new ways or the new kind of regulation. But
give an example, please. I'm sorry to interrupt. Can you give us an example of one of the sandbox projects to illustrate?
For example, Yes, we are. I have to say that in 2020 we are in the first phase, of the project, because we developed the old regulatory framework of the rules in our regulatory framework in Colombia, but it is in 2021 when we will apply, or the companies can apply for the projects. But we are analyzing with, for example, different programs like Movistar or Telefonica for connectivity in rural areas, or with Facebook. We are analyzing different ways to improve the connectivity in rural areas too. But for example, in postal sector, to improve the e-commerce, we are analyzing with the postal companies different projects for use of drones in the postal service, or for new postal services, as I don't know. We have different ideas, but it's in 2021 our first call for the companies. So we are hoping that the companies want to apply for the public call. But I don't know. I believe that it's not only the sandbox. It's not only that is only a way to have flexibility in the regulation or in the regulatory framework. But all our regulatory agenda for 2021 and 2022, we are proposing a stronger, convergent, pro-competition and investment work plan, which creates, because we want to create an environment conducive to new and established players, which benefit citizens with more offer of communication services, greater coverage, and better prices.
Thank you, Carlos. Interesting. Dr. Modimoeng, so you tell us a bit more of how South Africa is welcoming or enabling new stakeholders that can provide not only connectivity, but also relevant content or health services or educational content, etc. How are you implementing this needed coordination with different ministries, with different stakeholders that have a role in the digital transformation?
Yes, no, thank you. We operate in a multi-stakeholder environment. We are the sole regulator in our country for broadcasting, telecommunications, and postal services. And there is always a cross-cutting dependency and mandate in as far as it relates to the sectors that we regulate and their relationships with various, government departments. So during this pandemic period, we engaged quite extensively with various government departments, because we regulate technologies, and technology is an enabler in this regard. So on the question of what we are doing for new entrants and how we've handled, I touched on the issue of the utilization of TV white spaces during this period. And with that, we allowed TV white space network operators, which are approved by ourselves, to use the services free of charge. And this is in an effort to improve national broadband and internet capacity, aiming to provide relevant, up-to-date information to the public during this particular period. But now, touching with the input of my colleagues on the Colombia side of the regulation, we are in the process of licensing spectrum on a permanent basis. And we have what we call a wireless open access network, a WOAN, which is designed. So the one part of the auction of the spectrum will be released via an auction. The other part is to cater for the question which has just been posed of creating a room for a new entrant at a wholesale level. In this particular regard, it means, the landscape of the telecom sector will change. There will be a number of participants, through consortium or various business groupings, women, youth, disadvantaged, previously marginalized in the economy and so forth. So the experience and lessons learned from this COVID period enabled us to actually fast track the process of permanently assigning a spectrum through an auction, which will happen in March of 2021, and through the wireless open access network, which will happen later in the year. So that's how we are responding and have responded, both on a permanent basis as well as on an emergency basis. Thank you.
Thank you. Very, very interesting. Different models of spectrum assignments, spectrum sharing through white spaces for broadband, for a more efficient use also of spectrum that in rural areas mostly remains subutilized. Karla, so what have you seen in your experience from a policy point of view? Are these main barriers or challenges for rural connectivity in Latin America? What's been your experience, or on the opposite, good practices? I know, for instance, Brazil has a strong policy of promoting small and medium companies, small operators, and has a different set of policy and for fixed broadband providers that account for almost 35% of the market in Brazil, fixed broadband, whether in rural or urban areas. So what do you see as those challenges that may be similar to those in other regions?
Yes, thank you, Adriana. So most of the barriers that face, for example, community networks or community-based connectivity initiatives are access to spectrum and also the deployment of infrastructure, or even access to infrastructure, because it's very expensive to deploy a network and to create a network itself. Now it has become more, it has become cheaper than 10 years ago, but it's even still expensive. So, for example, on the access to spectrum, there have been, many of the initiatives uses the free license exempt bands for access points, point-to-point networks. But now, with the pandemic, these bands are saturated. There's a lot of internet service providers that are using these bands, and the quality of the internet is very low. So one of the things that community networks that are wireless have faced is that the internet is very slow. It's almost impossible to communicate or even share or access to information. So one of the things that have been mentioned to the governments and regulators is if other bands could be used for this access points, wireless access points. On the other hand, for example, we have had conversations with governments, so to see the possibility of sharing infrastructure, because the governments already have fiber deployed, or they have different infrastructure. They have posts or masts that have to do with other types of infrastructure, and this infrastructure can be useful for the deployment of connectivity. And not only the ones that the government has, but also with other internet companies, other bigger companies that provide internet and provide services. And perhaps they will not reach to the smallest areas, right? So it's a way of talking with the different stakeholders, with the different actors that are involved, and just speaking, what are the best ways of connecting the people that are unconnected? How can we do that? And how can we work together in order to do it, right? So those are some of the problems that we have faced. And for example, now that we are facing COVID-19, in Mexico, there's an organization that now has access to the 10 gigahertz band, and now this organization this access to spectrum and this frequency, specifically a portion of this frequency, to use it as a backhaul for the network and to expand the network and provide better connectivity, and even include 4G to the services, like to expand the network and make it a better network for the ones that are already involved. So these are some of the examples that we have faced. And I see now with COVID-19 that governments are more open to hear about other alternatives to connectivity. They are reaching out to us and we are reaching out to them. So we're having multiple conversations among us, which I find very, very successful, very good. Yes. So.
Intense collaboration and wonderful. Thank you, Nate, because I'd like to give us a lot for question and answers. And so I was wondering, who on LinkedIn, is there any appetite for a workforce that has skills for telemedicine or teleeducation content creation on one hand, and on the other, where are we seeing more demand? I mean, demand for workforce from SMEs, small and medium enterprises, from large corporations, and in which areas, again, is more demand for skills?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I noted some of your earlier questions as well, scribbling notes furiously to try and take it down. So just to start with, as we approach data and insights from the graph, it's important also to note that we use aggregated statistics. One of your earlier questions was on member privacy and how we build trust with members. We don't have a member network without trust. And so trust is the most important thing. So anytime we talk about insights that we can derive from the graph, I'm talking about aggregated insights that are private and anonymized and can't be reduced back to a member's identity. So to get to the substance of your question, what does LinkedIn actually see? We actually do have a little bit of data. I don't know if I could share my screen. Is that possible, Adriana? Let's give this a try. If this breaks in real time, it's gonna be my fault entirely.
Make it the large screen, please. The large one.
Okay, let's see if we can give this a try. All right. So let me know if you guys can see the screen here. How does that look?
A bit small. Can you enlarge it?
let me see if I can. A little bit better?
Yeah.
Okay. So what I'm doing is I'm using a tool that we developed called LinkedIn Talent Insights. And in the left-hand panel, you can see different filters that are possible. And I've filtered for different locations, Colombia, Mexico, and South Africa, just because of the representation on the panel. And I'm also filtering for the telecommunications industry. I could filter by skill, I could filter by function. Adriana, your question about business size, that's something that we're considering, so not there just yet. You didn't ask about gender, but we do also include gender cuts from the data that's available. So when we look at LinkedIn's graph to try to draw insights from it, and this is a tool that we make available to education institutions or to employers, it's part of our enterprise set of solutions. So we can start by looking at the skills that are common in telecom in those three countries, and look at the share of those skills across the industry. And then critically, we can look at see what the fastest growing skills are for telecom in the three countries that I've designated here. And the use case for this information is a couple different things. For employers who are providing jobs, we hope that they can use this to build more representative job postings and communicate the skill needs that they have, and also anticipate the skill needs that they may have based on what we're seeing across the industry. For educators, we hope that this information can be used to build curricula that prepares graduates for the jobs that are, not the jobs that were 5 or 10 or 20 years ago, or whenever the curricula was last developed. So we hope to build more of a real-time loop between employers and educators. So if we look at the data for these three countries that we've selected, preventative maintenance is very high. You see a couple hard skills on here, data analysis, engineering. You also do see a lot of soft skills that come up, and a lot of folks have wondered what will happen to soft skills, because there's so much noise made about hard technical skills. But we see customer experience, technical support still showing up prominently. So the other thing that we can take a look at with this data are the job posts that derive, the insights are based on. So if you were to look at, for example, something like analytical skills, you can see here that there are jobs that are coming up in these economies. So it's not the case that the economy has shut down necessarily. We believe that there is opportunity. It's just difficult to surface opportunity and relate that back to demand for skills. And we hope we can bridge that information gap. The other quick thing that I'll look at here, and then I'll turn the time back over, is we can also see transitions that happen in and out of industry. So again, we're looking at telecommunications. We can see job posts that relate to that. But if we look at other industries that are adjacent to it, we begin to see where professionals who have telecommunication skills, where they come from, and then where they can go after their time in the industry has ended. So you see, the IT field obviously is a source of talent for the telecommunications industry. Financial services appears to be another source of talent for the industry. You can see the ratio here: professionals gained over professionals lost. What we hope to do here is establish natural industry adjacencies. So you could do this with an industry, or you could do this with a function or a skill as well. But you can see what places are adjacent to a certain market or demographic, and then help people make a transition from one place to the next. And again, if we do this more and more, and we get accustomed as policymakers, as the private sector, to looking in the data to develop solutions for workers who have been dislocated, or for employers that need talent, this is an example of a tool that we hope can produce more insights for that market. More I could show you, but I'll leave it there, because you just asked me one question, and I'll know when to stop.
Really interesting and important to know where the supply and demand side are, and hopefully you'll be able to share, if possible, those slides to the IIC event. I don't know if it's possible or not.
That was a real time. It's actually a product, so I don't have slides for it, but I could send screenshots for sure.
Okay, and so we do see that the digital transformation is also, yes, maybe we lose some jobs, but others are being created. Of course, the new ones do require, no matter in what area they are, digital skills. Even as a physician, if you want to be able to make, not to mention a surgery, but some kind of a telemedicine diagnosis or ultrasound, whatever, there are skills you have to gain. And so also important would be to know how rural people are using LinkedIn, or if they are, or because there's also something in Latin America, there's a huge informal economy. And that, I think, could have an impact on on the way employment is recruited, is found, and how skills are recruited more on an informal basis. Anyway, I don't see questions. Let me see. I don't see any questions. Please, to the audience, I'd love to try to see questions and have the panelists answer them, whether related to government connectivity, eHealth, new strategies to connect the unconnected, or for the digital transformation, whatever. Feel free, please, to ask them through the question and answer tool. And in the meantime, let me open the floor to either of you who wants to share some additional thoughts of the more permanent agenda in your countries or in the region to implement on a permanent basis policies that can enable. I mean, sometimes governments tend to say, I'm going to supply the service, instead of creating an enabling environment that incentivize investment, whether they are local, national, or global investments on different areas, not only the networks. And so Carlos, Dr. Modimoeng, Karla, and lastly Nate, any thoughts?
I have a couple thoughts to share, and it relates to the last part of your prompt on role of government. We did get a lot of inbound interest from government when the pandemic hit, asking if we could help the government build jobs portals so that workers could see jobs and apply to them. And our reaction was, that's a great idea. We've already done that. and not just LinkedIn, but Indeed, Google, and a host of other companies have a really robust and working private sector set of solutions, and we differentiate based on features. But the job posting themselves have become increasingly commoditized over the last years. And so I think where the industry has ended up is a really healthy place where an employer can put a job out into the ecosystem, and then that job can be picked up by not just that employer's own applicant tracking system and HRIS systems, but entities like LinkedIn and Google and Glassdoor and Indeed and a host of others. And so, government didn't need to build a lot of that infrastructure to help people get back to work in the pandemic, because it had already happened. There were already market dynamics at force that had created a really good set of potential solutions for consumers to access. One thing that we did see that I think is a good area for policymakers to think really hard about is how to become more resilient for the next crisis. And specifically, I refer to the workforce investment system, at least in the United States, was anchored on a network of about 2,300 physical job centers. So places where a job seeker could walk in off the street and get help crafting a resume, creating a profile, interviewing tips, that sort of thing. And all at the same time, the pandemic hit, everything was shut down, and the workers who needed government services to become reemployed weren't able to access them. And it was just this perfect storm of the pandemic limiting physical services and the government not having invested in digital services. And so I think when we look back on government response to the pandemic, we'll notice governments that had the type of digital infrastructure in place and were much more successful than other governments who didn't. I think that's going to be an interesting reckoning.
Thank you. And also, if we want to see more women in the workforce, we need to really implement good, flexible work at home plans, but not to have an 18-hour journey of work, family, house, etc. Have flexibility for men to also take care more of the family while women are working. But so telework, I think, and I've seen some tools in LinkedIn providing good practices on how you can have a fair, manageable work journey at home, and also have a private life and family life. Karla, you raised your hand wheel. I have only 4 minutes to go.
Yes, thank you. No, just very quickly, I wanted to end with these questions that have arisen from our conversation with people in the communities. That, for example, some of the communities, well, we're talking about digital enablement and digital measures, but there are even, for example, some communities and some people, some elderly people that don't want to be connected or don't see any they don't find it important, right? So I believe it's also to respect the decision of the people that don't want to be involved or that want to be involved, but maybe perhaps in other terms, or because when we talk about inclusion and access, some of the people are afraid of getting online because of all these digital security issues that happen. Perhaps they are defending their territories, or they want to preserve their language and their types of and their ways of living. So this is another conversation and another issue that has to be discussed as well and has to be taken into account. Because if we believe that governments if we're looking that governments are implementing these measures and bringing e-government and e-health and e-education, which benefits most of the population, but there are other people that want to bring this to discussion, right? And want to talk about this and want to be involved in some other way. So perhaps this is another thing that should be also taken into account, and that should be in the agenda for when discussing this digital enablement, right? So I just wanted to mention.
So communities, not only as consumers, but as active stakeholders, part of the dialogue, to take them into account what kind of connectivity, services, content, language they want, and how they can, as a complement, have their own infrastructure and network in places where market or state have failed to provide it sustainably, right? Dr. Modimoeng, so what's your perception on how to get a sustainable telemedicine, telework, teleeducation project? What's your experience about that?
Yes, no, I think in the South African context, we need to release spectrum. It's been about 14 years since spectrum was last released on a large scale. And with that is also the issue of affordability to end users, because we can come up with all these programs and solutions, but as long as the cost to communicate remains high, it's a barrier on its own. And I think these are the two issues that we are quite preoccupied with: the licensing of spectrum, as well as ensuring that there is a meaningful reduction in the cost to communicate without compromising the quality of services. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you all for listening to us. This part of the Sustainable Goals Agenda for 2030, to both innovate and to experience a digital transformation, but leaving no one behind. And if we want to leave no one behind, we need to do things differently with new paradigms, new mindsets, and experiment. I think regulation has to serve a purpose. It should never be a barrier, but an equalizer and a promoter of new ways of better life quality for all adults and children, men and women, rural and urban,